No one had stepped onto the ranch in years, and the silence around it felt heavier than fear. The rancher had learned to live with that silence, trusting no one, expecting nothing. Then one freezing night, the sound of horses broke the stillness. He reached for his rifle as 10 Apache warriors slowly emerged from the dark. They did not shout. They did not attack. They stood wounded, tired, and surrounded by danger. Their leader stepped forward and asked for shelter in a calm but desperate voice. The rancher's heart pounded because stories of bloodshed rushed through his mind. He knew helping them could bring death before sunrise, while refusing them could start a war on his land. He looked at their injuries, their exhausted faces, and the cold night behind them. This was not just a request for shelter. It was a test of courage, fear, and humanity. One wrong choice could end his life forever, and the night waited silently for his answer. The rancher was a quiet man who lived completely alone, and loneliness had become his daily reality. His wife had died many years ago, leaving memories that never faded, and his children were scattered far away, never to return. The ranch, once filled with laughter, slowly turned into a place of shadows and silence. People in nearby towns whispered stories about his land, calling it cursed, haunted, and dangerous. No one dared to visit. And the rancher did not stop them. He learned to survive without neighbors, without comfort, and without hope. Days passed without a single voice, and nights stretched endlessly with only the wind for company. The silence became his shield and his prison at the same time. He believed nothing could disturb this lonely life anymore. Then fate began moving quietly toward his door, preparing a moment that would shatter his isolation forever and force him to face a choice he never expected. As darkness fell, the rancher heard slow footsteps mixing with the soft sound of horses breathing just beyond the fence, and his body froze as instinct took control. He moved toward the gate with careful steps, and that was when he saw them, 10 Apache men standing in the shadows, alert, but clearly exhausted, their clothes torn, their faces marked with pain and long travel. They did not rush forward, and they did not lift their weapons, which made the moment even heavier. Their leader stepped ahead just enough for the moonlight to reveal his face, and in a calm, steady voice, he asked for one night of shelter. The words hung in the air, and fear tightened around the rancher's chest because silence like this often came before violence. He noticed fresh wounds bandaged with rough cloth and eyes that carried both strength and desperation. The night felt colder as tension settled between them like an unseen wall. The rancher's hand hovered near his rifle, but he did not raise it because something about their stillness felt controlled, not threatening. The horses shifted behind them, tired and restless, as if they too had traveled far without rest. The rancher's mind struggled to keep up as old warnings echoed in his thoughts, stories passed down through generations, stories of raids and bloodshed. Yet what stood before him now did not match those memories. These men looked hunted, not hunting, and the leader's voice carried no demand, only quiet need. The rancher swallowed hard, realizing this encounter was no accident, but a moment shaped by fate itself. The wind brushed across the dry ground, carrying dust and the smell of sweat and leather. And for a brief second, time seemed to pause. That he studied their faces one by one, seeing pain, discipline, and a strange respect in the way they waited without moving. No insults were spoken, no threats were made, and that silence pressed harder than shouting ever could. The rancher felt fear, yes, but beneath it was something else, a pull he had not felt in years, a sense that this choice mattered more than his own safety. The land around them had seen loneliness for too long, and now it was witnessing a test of human will. The Apache leader lowered his gaze slightly, not as weakness, but as patience, giving the rancher space to decide, while the others remained still like shadows carved from stone. The rancher's breath slowed as he realized they trusted him enough to wait, and that trust carried weight heavier than any weapon. He could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears, and every second stretched painfully long. The night watched them, the ranch, the sky, and the land, holding their breath, because this was not just about shelter, it was about fear meeting mercy and survival crossing paths with choice. The rancher knew that whatever he decided in this moment would echo far beyond this gate and far beyond this night. And as he stood there facing 10 strangers under a cold, dark sky, the silence demanded an answer that would change everything forever. The rancher's thoughts collided as fear tightened his chest, and old stories whispered warnings he had heard since childhood, tales filled with loss and regret. Yet when he met their eyes, he did not see cruelty. He saw exhaustion shaped by long roads and constant danger. His hands trembled as he lowered his rifle, and the simple motion felt heavier than any battle he had ever imagined. The leader waited without pressure, giving space, as if understanding the weight of that choice. And in that pause, the rancher felt the loneliness of his years press against him, reminding him how silence had ruled his life for too long. That he stepped aside and opened the gate just enough to signal permission, and the sound of wood creaking echoed like a promise made under the night sky. The men entered slowly, careful to show respect, and relief washed over their faces, though none spoke a word. The rancher guided them toward the barn, where warm air lingered and shadows offered cover from the cold wind. He brought water first, watching their careful gratitude as they drank without greed, then returned with bread and simple food, his heart pounding as he placed it between them. They accepted with quiet thanks, their movements controlled and gentle, and the rancher felt tension ease, though fear still lingered like a distant storm. He noticed how they tended to one another, checking wounds, sharing cloth, and offering support without complaint, and the sight stirred something deep within him, a memory of family, of care once lost. He kept his distance at first, guarding the door through the long hours of darkness, listening to the barn breathe with low murmurs and the soft sound of horses settling. The night stretched on, and every creak made his muscles tighten, yet nothing broke the fragile calm that as hours passed. He realized he was no longer waiting for betrayal, but for dawn, and that shift surprised him. When the sky finally softened with early light, the leader approached slowly, his posture open, his expression steady, and offered thanks not as a favor received, but as respect earned. He spoke of enemies close behind and of a journey driven by survival, not conquest, and the rancher listened, sensing honesty in every word. Before leaving, the leader placed a hand over his heart and promised that no harm would ever come to this land while they lived, and the promise carried a quiet strength that felt unbreakable. The men mounted their horses and departed without noise, leaving behind a stillness that felt different, warmer somehow. As the dust settled, the rancher stood alone again, yet the loneliness no longer felt empty, because something had changed within him. He realized that fear had not won that night, and kindness had carved a new path across his land. The sun rose fully, revealing the ranch bathed in calm light, and the rancher breathed deeply, knowing that a single decision had rewritten his future, and that the silence which returned now carried protection instead of dread, and hope instead of loss. He remained by the door through the long night, listening to every breath and movement, while the quiet inside the barn felt heavier than noise ever could. The fire burned low, casting slow shadows across the walls, and each flicker made his senses sharpen, as if danger might rise without warning. The Apaches rested without complaint, tending wounds with care and discipline, and their silence carried respect rather than threat. The rancher felt time stretch as hours passed, marked only by the distant call of night birds and the soft shift of horses outside. His eyes burned with exhaustion, yet he refused to sit, because trust was fragile, and he understood that peace required vigilance. The cold air crept in, and he pulled his coat tighter, feeling the weight of his choice settle deep within him. He wondered if this night would be remembered as the moment everything ended, or the moment something unexpected began. The leader remained awake as well, meeting his gaze across the space and offering a calm nod that spoke of shared awareness without words. The rancher realized that both sides were guarding not against each other, but against the unknown that followed them both. When the fire finally dimmed, he stepped outside, briefly scanning the land, expecting movement in the distance, yet the darkness held still, as if honoring a fragile agreement. He returned inside and leaned against the door, his thoughts drifting to years of solitude and how fear had shaped his days without him noticing. Now fear felt different, no longer sharp, but heavy, mixed with responsibility. As dawn slowly approached, the sky softened and the night loosened its grip, and with each pale hint of light, his chest eased. The Apaches began to stir quietly, preparing to leave without being asked, and the rancher watched, noticing the care they took to leave no trace of harm or disorder. The leader approached once more, his voice low and steady, expressing gratitude without exaggeration and speaking of respect earned through action rather than words. The rancher listened, sensing that this meeting would echo beyond the morning and beyond his understanding. When they finally stepped out into the open, the land looked unchanged, yet everything felt altered. The men mounted their horses and paused briefly, as if sealing an unspoken bond before turning away and riding into the distance. The rancher stood alone again, but the silence no longer felt empty because it carried memory and meaning. That he closed the barn door slowly, feeling a strange calm settle within him, knowing that the night he feared had passed without violence and that sunrise had arrived peacefully. The land breathed with him, and for the first time in years he felt that his ranch was not just a place of survival, but a place where courage had quietly rewritten fate. The promise settled into the quiet morning like a vow spoken to the land itself, and as the Apache leader finished his words, the rancher felt a weight lift that he had carried for years without knowing its name. The men turned their horses with calm purpose, moving as one, and the sound of hooves faded slowly into the open plains, leaving behind only dust and early sunlight. The rancher stood still, watching until they disappeared beyond the rise, and the silence returned, not empty, but steady, as if the land itself had accepted what had happened. He walked back toward the house, noticing how the air felt lighter and how his breath came easier than it had in a long time. Days passed, and then weeks, and the rancher began to sense change in small details. Travelers no longer avoided the road nearby. Strangers crossed the land without fear, and the nights felt less threatening. He heard distant signals, at times not meant for him, yet clearly meant to warn others away. And though he never saw the Apaches again, he felt their presence like unseen guardians. Old fears lost their grip as routine returned, and work filled his days with renewed purpose. He repaired fences, tended animals, and rested at night, without gripping his rifle at every sound. Seasons shifted and stories traveled quietly through nearby towns about a ranch that stood untouched while others faced trouble. The rancher never spoke of that night because he understood some bonds lived best in silence. He noticed how loneliness softened into peace and how memories of loss no longer carried sharp edges. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he stood at the edge of his land and realized he was no longer waiting for something bad to happen. The promise given at dawn had grown roots deep in the soil, shaping his future without demand or reward. Years later, when strangers asked why his ranch remained safe, he simply shrugged and said, "Respect goes a long way." He knew fear once ruled his choices, but one night of courage had rewritten his path. The land thrived, animals grazed calmly, and the ranch became known not as cursed, but as protected. The rancher aged with quiet dignity, carrying gratitude instead of regret, and when he finally rested, he did so knowing his life had meaning beyond survival. That single act of humanity had turned isolation into legacy and silence into strength, and though the Apaches remained unseen, their honor lived on through every peaceful sunrise that followed. From that day on, the ranch carried a quiet strength that could be felt but never seen, and those who crossed its land sensed peace instead of danger. Strangers passed through safely, guided by an unseen promise, and none questioned why harm never touched that soil. The rancher continued his days with calm purpose, knowing he was no longer guarded by fear, but by honor. That he still lived alone, yet loneliness no longer followed him because courage had filled that empty space. His nights grew softer, his sleep deeper, and his heart lighter with every sunrise that arrived without threat. He never spoke of the warriors or the vow made at dawn, because some truths were meant to live beyond words. One brave choice had transformed a broken life into a lasting legacy, proving that kindness could stand stronger than violence. The ranch became a symbol of silent protection, and the rancher became part of something greater than himself. And even after he was gone, the land remembered him, holding that promise forever.